In this video, we're going to do a deep dive on variables and comments in Python. Now, computers are efficient with their memory, so when a program is running, it will not store any data or values unless we explicitly tell the runtime that we want to keep the data around. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to declare variables and assign them values. We're also going to define some programmer terms, because if you want to be a professional programmer, you need to speak like one. So we're going to talk about variable, assignment, statement, and expression and evaluation. We're also going to learn how to add comments to Python code files. I'm going to identify some best practices for naming your variables. And we will also look at a name error, which is one of the most common errors that beginners are going to run into. So first, I'm going to go ahead and create a file that I'm going to use for my sample code here. I'm going to call it var.py. And we'll go ahead and get started with comments first, because comments are pretty simple. They are a block of text that is going to be ignored by the Python interpreter. Comments are not programming statements, and it makes them useful for leaving notes and documentation for yourself or other developers. And I'm going to be leaving comments in the code samples to help explain certain concepts. So in Python, a comment starts with a hashtag character, and you notice that turned green. So whatever IDE you're using, whether it's Visual Studio Code or PyCharm, pay attention to the colors of the text that you're typing into your code file, because they are going to give you hints about what's going on, and I'm going to call that out during this lesson. So the hashtag means a comment, and I can basically type anything I want in here. I'll write, "This is a comment." Try to spell it correctly. It won't be executed. And this basically lets us, when we have complicated formulas, when we have functions, another way to use it when you're a beginner is to kind of outline your code, because you should always think before you start writing code. And you can use comments to kind of outline a process, like, hey, I'm going to read some data from a user. I'm going to store it. Now I'm going to calculate something. Then I'm going to print it. And you can kind of use this to kind of put a template around the code that you're about to write so that you don't miss any steps or forget anything. So comments are really useful. And early on, I encourage you to use a lot of comments to help your understanding. When you become a professional developer, you will use less comments, because you should not put obvious comments in your code. Whenever you're thinking about comments in existing code, you should always first look to say, well, can I rewrite this code so that it's more expressive and people can understand it without using a comment? But sometimes you can't avoid it, because you're going to reference some documentation, you're going to reference some formula, and then sometimes you're just doing something really complicated and you need to leave some helpful pointers. But you can leave as many comments as you want throughout a code file. This is another comment. Anytime you need to leave yourself a note, go ahead and put a hashtag in there and leave whatever notes you need to leave. Now, another thing to know about comments is that you can put them after statements. So if I have a statement like print hello world, I can put a hashtag at the end of that line. This won't impact the statement. So, and I can prove that. I can save it. I can run this file. And we see that hello world prints just fine. None of the comments actually did anything to the output of the program. And another thing you can do is comment out code. So if you ever run into a situation where you think a block of code is problematic, or maybe you want to turn it off temporarily for some debugging purposes, you can actually put a hashtag in front of a statement. It will comment out that line of code. And then, of course, you can take it out if you want to restore the functionality of that line. Developers officially call this commenting out your code. And if you're using Visual Studio Code, a nice shortcut, let me just add a couple more print statements here. A nice shortcut you can use is you can highlight a bunch of statements, and you can hold the Control key and then press K and then C, and it will comment out a block of code all at once. You can also hold the Control key, press K, and then press U, and it will uncomment the block of code. So that's just one thing as you learn to be a programmer. pay attention to some of the hotkeys that are available in your IDE because it will make you more productive to type things and use these hotkeys instead of using your mouse. So before I start demonstrating variables, we're going to cover a little bit of terminology because this is important. I want you to talk like a real programmer. So in programming, a statement is the smallest unit of code that can be executed. Now, we already wrote statements before when we printed hello world to the terminal. Now, some programming languages terminate or end statements with a special symbol, such as a semicolon. That is not the case in Python. In Python, white space has meaning, and statements are terminated by a new line. So a statement can also extend to more than one line if the parts are grouped inside what I would call a container symbol, like a parenthesis, or curly braces, or square bracket. So as an example, if I just type print, this is a statement. This is statement 1. And then if I print, this is statement 2. And if I want to do a quick multiple line statement to demonstrate the container characters, I can say print, put my parentheses, and anything inside the parentheses, even if it extends across multiple lines, is going to be part of the same statement. So I'm going to say this is part of the statement, and then I'll do another string. This is another part of the statement. And in Python, when you put multiple strings inside a print statement like this, it's going to do something called concatenation, which is another developer term. And concatenation is a big fancy word, but all it means is we're going to take both strings and we're going to smash them together. So if I save and run this program, you'll see that this statement printed all on one line. I added this leading space here because I didn't want it to be smashed up against it. So when you are doing concatenation as a programmer, one thing you have to be careful of is watching those spaces, because if I don't add that space, notice now the text runs together. Hey, Eric here. If you're enjoying this tutorial, please like, comment, and subscribe, because that is the best way to help me out as an independent creator. But if you're serious about going from zero to professional coder, you should check out skillfoundry.io. We have detailed lessons, we have videos, we have exercises, we have capstone projects. There's a whole community of peers and mentors like myself to answer your questions and help you get unstuck. And if you don't want to go it alone, there is now a mentorship plan where you can work directly and privately with a professional like me. Now back to the video. So now moving along, let's talk about expressions. Now, every statement may contain one or more expressions. An expression can be a combination of values, variables, operators, and functions. And we're going to learn more about those components later. But consider these examples. I can type something like 5 plus 3, and that is a math expression. I could also do something like 10 is greater than 2, and that's a Boolean expression. And by Boolean, we mean true or false. 10 is greater than 2, that is true. And then we can also combine expressions in statements. So if I say something like print 5 plus 3, now we have a math expression inside a Boolean, or inside a function expression. So these expressions, when you write them in code, they are evaluated. And that is a key term in programming, evaluation. Evaluation is what the Python runtime is doing with your code. So in our example above here, the math expression 5 plus 3 evaluates to 8. And when multiple expressions are present in the same statement, like this line right here, the interpreter is going to use a specific order of operations. This is just like basic math back when you were in grade school. It's going to evaluate the expressions in a specific order. For example, in this statement, it's going to evaluate 5 plus 3, which becomes 8, and then it's going to pass the outcome of that evaluation into the print function, and it will print 8. And again, I can prove that by just running my script again. And you see that it printed 8. But notice that it didn't print this 8, and it didn't print the value of true. And this is a key concept for beginners. Just because you have an expression doesn't mean that it prints, and it doesn't mean that it gets stored anywhere. These expressions are evaluated. It's happening in the back end. But because we didn't do anything with those values, the Python interpreter evaluates it, does the math, 8 and true, but then it just immediately discards the data. The data is lost. It's forgotten. Computers are actually quite stupid. They will only remember things or do things if you explicitly tell them to. So if we wanted to print the value of true, we need to pass this expression into the function. And once we do that, now we're going to see it's going to print true and then 8. So just be aware of that difference. And now we're ready to talk about variables. Because as we just demonstrated, it forgets all of the information unless we tell it to remember. And variables are the way that we tell our program to remember some data for us. And if we're going to use a variable in Python, there are 2 terms that we're going to use. The first is something called declaration. And declaration is the formal process of telling the computer, I want you to remember something. And that needs to be assigned to something called an identifier. An identifier is just a label or a name. So you're basically having a conversation with your program. Like imagine that we're just speaking to it like a human being. And you say, hey, I want you to remember the value 8. Well, the computer is going to say, well, when you want the value 8 back, what are you going to call it? It's asking you for a label, like if we were storing it in a drawer or a filing cabinet. It wants a label so that when you say that word, it knows that it should go get the value 8. So here's an example. I'm going to say greeting equals, now notice that turned blue. And in Visual Studio Code, that light blue color, that means that we're working with a variable. The computer is going to remember something for me. And then I put an equal sign. And the equal sign is very important because the equal sign is called the assignment operator. So I declare a variable named greeting, and then I say equal, and I am going to assign it a value. And I'll say hello, comma, world. So now the Python interpreter is going to evaluate this, and it's going to say, I have a literal string, hello world, and I am going to assign it to the identifier named greeting. And once I do that, now anywhere else in my program where I use the word greeting, Python is going to substitute the value that is currently assigned to it. So if I just say print greeting, what's going to happen is Python is going to say, okay, I want to print something. Oh, greeting. What is that? And it's going to go and look and it's going to say, oh, that's a variable. What's inside the variable? This is the evaluation, getting the value out, hello world, and it's going to pass that into the print state. So again, if I save this and now I run it, you'll see that it prints hello world, which is the value of greeting. So this is called assignment. Now, once you have a variable created, you can also reassign. And you use that by using the equal sign again. So I can say, well, now I want the value of greeting to change. I would like it to be, hello new world. And then again, if I print greeting and run this, you're going to see that first it's going to print hello world, and then the next time it's going to go get the value just like it did before, except we've changed it. So you're going to see both of these print out. So we can create variables, we can assign them, we can reassign them, and then reuse them throughout our programs. So now let's show some more examples. So let's declare and assign a number. So I'm just going to call this one num1, and I'm going to say equals 5. And then I'm going to declare and assign a second one. Num2 is equal to 10. And now I'm going to declare a third variable called sum. And I'm going to set it equal to the expression num1 plus num2. And then I'm going to print the sum. And then I'm going to do something interesting. I'm going to update the value of num1. I'm going to set that to 10 as well. And then I'm going to print sum again. Now, what do you think will be printed when I run this code? I'll give you a second. Now, when I run this code, you're going to see it prints the sum 15, which we would expect because num1 plus num2, 10 plus 5, is equal to 15. And then I change the value of num1. This expression would be 10 plus 10, which would be 20, but the sum is still 15. And this is another key concept for people that are just getting started with programming. When you assign a variable to an expression like this, it is going to evaluate it immediately. So it's going to do the math with 10 and 5. And later on, if I change one of these other variables, it is not going to run this expression again. Again, computers are very stupid. They're very ordered. They're very logical, though. And this sum is going to be calculated at this point in time. And if I change the value later, if I don't reset sum by doing the math again, it's going to retain its original value. So your programs are not going to automatically recalculate or change their values unless you explicitly use the assignment operator to change them. Now, if I do it this way and I run it again, you'll see that it will print 15 and then 20. So now that we understand declaration and assignment, let's talk about identifiers. Let's talk about how to name your variables. Now, there's a few rules in Python and other languages too that you need to follow when you are declaring variables. Now, the first rule is that variable names can only contain an underscore character, A to Z, and 0 to 9. So no other characters are valid. I can have a variable named sum1. I can have a variable named underscore, foo. That's perfectly fine. I cannot have a variable that starts with a number. So one sum equals 10. You notice that turned red. You're not allowed to do this. So your variables either start with a letter or they start with an underscore. There's no other valid options. Now, in Python, if I have a variable that has multiple words, like I want to store somebody's first name, in Python, the convention is to put an underscore in between them. So first name equals Eric. That's how they like to do that. In some other languages, they'll do it like this, but Python people, they like this. This is called snake case. Also, when you're declaring variables, make sure that the variable names are descriptive. Now, I used first name here. You could just say f_n equals Eric, but then when some other developer comes along and reads your code, they're going to be like, what is fn? That doesn't really mean anything. So one of the key concepts to kind of keep in mind as you start writing code is you're writing code for other humans to read, because somebody else, and maybe even yourself, you might put this program away for 6 months and come back to it. And if you don't use good descriptive variable names, it's going to be much harder to read and understand and make changes to the code. So always be descriptive. And if you have more than one word, put an underscore between them. And now the last thing I want to show you is an error called the name error. So let's go ahead and set up a variable greeting equals hello. And then let's say I want to print this and I spell it wrong. So I forget the T. Now, it's going to warn me in the IDE, it's going to put an underline under this, but let's say I don't notice, I'm not really paying attention, and I go to run my script anyway, you're going to see something called a traceback. And this is how Python tells you about errors. And it's going to tell you what file it's in, var.py. It's going to tell you what line it happened at. And you can see that it identifies, hey, name error. The name greeting is not defined. And then it tries to help me a little bit. Did you mean greeting with a T? And this is a key error that you're going to see a lot as a beginner. When you see a name error, it means that you used an identifier that it doesn't recognize. It either hasn't been declared, you typoed it, or something like that. If I put the T back in, everything will be fine, and I can save and run my script. Another thing to notice and be aware of with programming is that most programming languages are case sensitive. So if I accidentally put this with a capital G instead of a lowercase g, Python sees those as two different names. So you do want to be aware of the casing of different things, especially when you're copying code from the internet or copying code from tutorials. Everything is case sensitive when it comes to the syntax. So be careful about that. If I run that, it gives me the name error. Now, one of the other rules of thumbs for identifiers in Python, these variable names, is they do like them to be lowercase. So you're not going to use uppercase characters for your variable names in most cases. And the last thing I'm going to advise you as a complete beginner is that when you receive these errors, go and look at the error type and really read the message. And if you're going to do a Google search or use an AI assistant to kind of help you with things, make sure that you give them this traceback information, because being able to read these and understand what they're telling you is a key skill for professional developers. You are going to see these all the time. And in real applications, these are going to appear in your log files and stuff. And when you're tracking down bugs, you are going to have to be able to read and interpret these. And as you get on your coding journey, you are going to see more different types of errors. But every error does have a type, and good error messages will tell you what they think the problem is. Now, this is where it gets frustrating for beginners because all error messages are not created equal. And some error messages are pretty vague, and honestly, they're pretty unhelpful. But you should always start with the traceback and really read it and really try to understand what it's trying to tell you. And now we understand how to create variables. We know how to assign them values. And this is going to make your programs a lot more interesting because we can start to store and then change our values. But be mindful of the rules for creating those variables and try to use short but descriptive terms. And when it comes to comments, like I said before, in professional coding, they're mostly used for documentation and non-obvious callouts. But as a beginner, feel free to over-comment your code, especially when it helps you with your learning. Happy coding.